Okay, so the next paper is going to be presented by Micaela Sviatschi, who is from Princeton University, Gangs, Labor, Mobility and Development. And then after, there's going to be a presentation by Elena Esposito from HEC, University of Lausanne. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to this presentation. All the papers have been super interesting. Let me know, do you see, perfect, there. You see my slides. Let me move this here. Okay, so today what I'm going to talk about is actually related to the beginning of the talk of Chris. So I'm going to be talking about gangs, labor, mobility, and development. This is joint work with Nikita Melnikov, who is here in Princeton, and Carlos Schmidt-Padilla from UC Berkeley. So the question when we started this is we wanted to understand how do non-state actors, once they get territorial control in developing countries, how this affect economic development, in particular in urban locations with criminal organizations. And actually the answer to these questions kind of varies. No? For instance, in developed societies, we may think that non-state actors, once they get territorial control, may have a negative effect on economic development, by mainly preventing the state from providing public goods, security, enforcing property rights. And then in the other extreme, for instance, in rural areas in developing countries, we might think that if the state is unable to control and provide public goods in certain locations, non-state actors can take the role of the state and fulfill those essential functions. However, we don't know much what happens in an intermediate case where we have both these state and non-state actors, here criminal organizations, coexisting very close to each other. So here what I'm going to focus is in criminal organizations which mainly function in urban centers, often controlling one part of the city, while the other part of the city is controlled by the state. And why criminal organizations? Well, criminal organizations have been responsible for a recent increase in violence across the developing world. The extreme case is Latin America, where we observe 43 of the 50 most murderous cities located there. And much of this violence that occurs in these cities has been attributed to these criminal organizations, which are drug cartels, in the case of today will be gangs, which in general have complete control of certain neighborhoods and sometimes even cities. For you to have an idea, the case of today of El Salvador, there is anecdotal evidence that suggests that 50% of the population lives in territories controlled by gangs. And this setting is quite common in Latin America. You will go there and you will know that there are certain neighborhoods that you cannot enter without the permission of these criminal actors. So today I'm going to focus on two main gangs in Latin America, which are the MS-13 and Neighborhood 18. There are similar groups present in other developing countries. They are mainly known for extorting and restricting mobility of individuals that live in the territory they control. And these are also the gangs that are potentially responsible for the recent increase in the influx of Central American refugees that we see coming to the US. So these are a huge deal. And as we have seen in many periods, when many people live under the rule of non-state actors like gangs, it's difficult to obtain causal evidence on the effects they have in development, mainly because of this that I said before, that sometimes they can be the result of the underlying conditions like weak rule of law. So here we are going to abstract from that by exploiting this natural experiment. So what happened in El Salvador and actually in North Central America is that in the early 1990s, there were no powerful gangs. There were small street gangs, of course, but very disorganized, nothing like a big criminal actor. Then in 1996, the US changed their migration policy. This increased the deportation of individuals with criminal records to El Salvador and Central America. And among those deportees, there were the leaders of gangs in the US that basically came back to El Salvador and they reestablished their gangs and quickly gained control over parts of the country. So using this experiment that I'm going to talk a bit more in a couple of slides, what we are going to do is first, we're going to explore to do a spatial relation discontinuity, where we're going to explore the exact boundaries here. It was funny that we were talking before about borders. These are kind of like artificial borders that they created in San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. And we will take advantage that these boundaries did not coincide with economic, crime, and geographical conditions. And then we're going to validate this analysis but doing at the national level. Remember that the RD will be only for the capital. At national level, we will do a definitive where we're going to compare the locations with gang presence to areas where these gangs did not settle before and after the shock in 1996. And we are going to look to several outcomes. We are going actually to look violence, household living conditions. Also, we conducted our own geocoded survey in these gang-controlled territories and nearby areas to understand a bit about these criminal governments, whether they provide some public goods, what is the role of the states. And we also are going to use light density data. So for the first question, what we see is that actually they have a negative effect in those neighborhoods. Individuals that live under gang control have significantly worse education, wealth, and lower income than individuals that just live 50 meters away in an area that is not controlled by gangs. So this is a very disaggregated comparison, and we see these big differences. Actually, the magnitudes are very high. This is for you to have an idea, it's like a 50% decline in income. And interestingly, when we were thinking that maybe these continuities existed, we wanted to understand in which places they settled. Actually, we see that before the arrival of these gangs, none of these discontinuities existed. And we actually validate this analysis with a different diff, and we actually see that after the deportation of these gang leaders in 1996, the locations with gang presence experienced lower luminosity growth than areas that do not experience those leaders. And actually, the divergence that we see took place right after the arrival of the gangs. Then the next thing that we want to try to understand, and here we are just shedding light because this is very difficult. There are many mechanisms that are behind these effects. But in particular, what we document is one unexplored mechanism, which is restrictions to mobility. Gangs, basically to keep this territorial control once they gain control of a certain part of the neighborhood, they intentionally limit the mobility of individuals living in their territory. And actually what happens is that also constrain the labor choices. What we see is that individuals that live in gang-controlled areas are less likely to work outside their neighborhood relative to the control group. And as a result, they end up working in small business and earning lower wages. We also show that the results in education are driven by higher dropout rates because there is more recruitment of gangs in these areas. Interestingly, as when we started this paper, we thought that we would see this would be a sort of state capacity, not the state not being able to enter into those places. But actually, since if you have to think about it, we are comparing places that are just blocks from another. We don't see any difference in public good provisions in terms of schools, hospital, roads, infrastructure. And also, we don't see that the results here are driven by violence, neither extortion, which is the main business, and cannot be fully explained by selective migrations of individuals. The results on violence are particularly important, and actually we see these things that we, in the second talk we were talking, is that in the borders you see a spike on violence actually right in the boundaries, but then you don't see that. And actually we do certain analysis to abstract from those locations. So let me give you a bit more of background. So this was the summary. So as I said before, the origin of these gangs actually they were not originated in Central America. So let me tell you the story of this leader of the main gang now in El Salvador, Diablito de Hollywood. If you go out to his biography of El Diablito de Hollywood, he actually grew up in LA, in Los Angeles, in the 1980s, when he came with his family that was fleeing civil war from El Salvador. And back in LA, you must have heard these stories. He lived in very rough neighborhoods where there were African-American gangs, Mexican gangs. And what the story says is that for self-defense reasons, he created with other Salvadorians the MS-13, and some others joined the neighborhood 18, which was the Mexican gangs. So they were very little, so they were not exposed, to conditions in Central America when they arrived, these leaders. But then in 1996, there was this change in deportation policy in the US and put El Diablito and these other Salvadorians back to El Salvador, now at an older age. And there is a very nice quote which they said that El Diablito said that they wanted to institutionalize extortion nationwide once they arrived there. And these same events, as I said before, happened also in Honduras and Guatemala, where we see big presence of these gangs controlling territory. But again, the situation of how it was El Salvador is very important because it's not like if I have to send like a bunch of leaders like here to yes, you will have these consequences. Actually, the situation in 1997 was that El Salvador was still recovering from the consequences of civil war. So many places did not have even a local police. So these gangs basically took advantage of this post-war reconstruction to embed themselves in neighborhoods and start exerting control. In the particular case of San Salvador, where we're going to do the RD, the gangs established boundaries right after their arrival. And it is true that they first arrived to neighborhoods where the state was not present. But then, soon after their arrival, they started to expand, recruiting new members. So they quickly expanded their control, and at the same time, the police realized that there were a problem. So they started to do things to kind of prevent So what we are going to try to take as exogenous here are the boundaries formation, but not the neighborhood. That's why we don't compare neighborhoods with gun control versus non-gun control. And what do they do there? So once they get control of a territory, they have total control. So they can decide everything that happens there. And as I was saying before, to prevent the rival gangs and police informants from entering the territory, they created these systems of checkpoints where the gangs can check if you are from this location or not by checking your ID card. And this is because in El Salvador, you have the address of residence. So this is something that they do a lot. So you enter this location, you need to show whether you're from there. And once they allow you to enter, you need to pay a toll, which is usually $1 to $3. So this helps them also to collect extortion. And okay, I will not give more details on this, and let's go to results since I have 10 minutes. So the region discontinuity design will be something simple. We're going to exploit these exact boundaries that were that the National Police gave us for 2015. This map was also validated by the main newspaper, El Diario de Hoy. Basically, they know gang presence because they distribute the newspaper. But if you go to El Salvador, everyone knows which are the boundaries and everything. It's something that is common knowledge there. And we actually validate these maps with earlier maps from the police. We used 2015 because this one was the one that the newspaper made public, and the police doesn't want to make any of these maps public because it's actually showing that the state lost control of a big part of the territory. So we use census data from 1992, before the arrival of these gangs from the US, 2007, and we also collect our own geocoded survey to 2,000 households in these locations. So this is the map of San Salvador. As you can see, in the blue and light areas, these are the areas that are controlled by gangs. So a big part of the territory is controlled by gangs. And here are the places that are controlled by the state. But something important I want to mention, which for me took me a while to understand this and will be important for interpretation of the results. They have territorial control here, but even though there are restrictions to mobility to normal citizens, the gangs can move, and they also have presence in the gray areas where the state has control. So what we do is first an RD, where we use as forcing variable the distance to the territory, and we also check the robustness to this specification. As I said before, how we have to interpret these first results is areas full control versus areas without full gang control, but some gang presence. So how were these locations before the arrival of gangs? So this is the RD, but for the 1992 census, and all characteristics also before the arrival of gangs, to try to see if there were some difference in this continuity. Neighborhood characteristics, nothing. It's not that these places were more urban at the boundary. Then in terms of the dwelling characteristics from census, it's not that the household have worse dwelling characteristics at all, neither on durables, we don't see any difference. The individual characteristics of educations in 1992, there were no differences. We also checked, sorry, here it's a bit weird, hope you can see this well. So we also check as a measure of crime, the number of incarcerations that we have geocoded before 1997, and we don't see any jump in those variables at the discontinuity. However, when we check 10 years later with the 2007 census, we see that there are big declines and big jumps here. So for instance, the dwelling characteristics are much worse, less likely to have the walls of a good material like concrete, less likely to have storage, lighting, cooking. Education declines by a lot. We also do the first principal component, there is this big decline. Also, if we want to measure in terms, this is the graph. Here what you can see is basically these are the areas that are under the control of gangs. These are the neighbor locations with no gang control, but some gang presence if they just basically cross the street. And you can see that there are these big jumps there in the discontinuity. What I wanted to show you as well is that we also collect information on income in our survey that we did in 2019. And again, we see this big decline. So overall, it seems that this having gang presence in your territory, there is a big negative effect on development outcomes in these urban neighborhoods. So I discussed the two main assumptions. One was this, that before the arrival of these gangs, there was no discontinuity that in these variables that I'm analyzing. But there is another test, which is no selective migration from gang control neighborhoods. Let me go fast to this, and then we can discuss more in the discussion if you have some doubts, because I want to have time for the mechanism, which I think is interesting. So we have two types of selective migration that we call here. One is in-sample migration that could affect our estimates, which means that we have some certain people from our treatment group that move into our control group, which is very nearby, and this could happen. So how we analyze if this is an issue? So basically, we restrict the sample to those individuals that have always lived in that location. And this is like 80% of the sample. We do this with our survey and also with the census. And what we see is that the results are the same. Even in magnitudes, we don't see any difference. We also do other things of out-of-sample selection, which means now people that I have in my sample, maybe it's in the US or in other municipalities. Overall, just to give you a summary of this, that can account like a 12% of our estimates, so it cannot be driving the results. So let me show you now part of the mechanisms. So the first mechanism we wanted to understand was these restrictions to mobility, which seems to be like very important. When we started the project, we thought that maybe this was a story of violence. We found out that that was not the case, that it's not that these areas are contested. If there is violence, it's when you try to enter the territory, and that's it, and if you are like a rival gang or a police informant. So we test these restrictions to mobility, and something important for you to have an idea about how much is the issue of restrictions to mobility is that in 2016, the criminal code was reformed to introduce this as a crime, like the illegal restriction of freedom of movement. And actually, we experienced that ourselves a lot of times in the field. So we ask, let's focus in the figure in the middle. We ask first, basically, we ask where people live. We actually make them show us in a map where they were working. We geocoded that. And what we see is that individuals in gun control areas are much more likely to work in the same place that they live, in a gun control location, relative to the control group. Still, we have a 40% that is allowed to be out. We don't know much about that population, but we will see that if we analyze the other effects for those that are allowed to leave, most of the effects mitigate. We also ask questions like whether they have visited like the next door department, where they have ever been to the beach. For you to have an idea, El Salvador is super small. So in 30 minutes, you can be in the beach. In 10 minutes, you can be visiting another department. And we see these declines in mobility. We also, as I was telling you before, so this is like basically the estimates that I showed you before about household income, but what we try to see is what happened for those individuals that are allowed to work outside. And what we see is that the effects are mitigated for those. Of course, these are not a random sample. We control by education of those, but still hold. So it seems that if you manage to get permission to work outside, you earn higher wages. However, importantly, let me skip the dropout because I think this is more important. It's not the case that these, once they work outside, they work in the control group. When we check the places where they are working, the ones that are allowed to work outside, they are working in these areas which are not in our control group, where most of the good firms are located. We also analyze if extortion and other crimes are changing the boundaries. We use administrative data from the main distribution firms of all the payments, sorry, it's this one, of all the payments that they have done to gangs that are geocoded. We don't see any differences. And this is mainly because even though they restrict mobility, the gangs are also active in our control group. So they control the territory, but they can also cross the street and extort firms there. That's why we don't see difference, that all this is driven by location of firms, like profit that they are earning, or extortion. However, let me show you a last result because I think I have like probably 2 minutes. Public goods, we don't see any difference, as I said at the beginning. Then the definitive, how we do it is basically we use the light density data. And what we do is to do the typical definitive where we put fixed effects by grids and by time. And what we do is to try to plot over time the places that have gang presence. Of course, here, the analysis is not as disaggregated as before. So this is more aggregated. We are doing at 0.5 kilometers. So it's much more aggregated. But it's interesting because here the mechanisms at play are a bit different because a bit more aggregate. But what we can get from this figure is first that there were no pre-trends. It's not that these locations were trending to be poorer, something that we couldn't see with the RD since we were comparing only 2 different moments in time. But second is that we see effects very large right and when they arrive, these leaders. And this is mainly caused by conflict between the 2 gangs. And here, if I wish I could show you, we would see the same graph and we would see that extortion also increased. But here I'm comparing places that have a that have gang presence versus places with no gang presence, okay? And before it was just basically seeing the discontinuity at the neighborhood level. So just to finalize, sorry, I feel like I went super fast, so you can ask me everything. What we learned from here is that this gang territorial control had a negative effect for individuals living there in those locations. In particular, we highlight this new mechanism, which is restrictions to mobility. This may be important when you have a rival gang just very close, that this may not happen in rural areas where the spaces are much more distant apart. The results that we see with restrictions to mobility are kind of similar to the standard international trade literature. In terms of policy implications, what I think is important is that often we think that these criminal actors or non-state actors, like violence is the main cause, but here what we are showing is that there is another cause once these criminal organizations have territorial control, kind of moderating these claims that less gang competition can be welfare improving. The second thing that I want you to to take away is that also this lack of labor mobility within Central America may also be affecting indirectly developed countries by increasing this number of individuals attempting to flee the country and seek refugee status. If you think about it, while you cannot basically escape these locations within your country because you will be found by these other gangs that have territorial control across the country. So that's why you may need help from other countries where these gangs do not have any type of territorial control. Thank you so much. I'm sorry that I went super fast.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so Elena Esposito is gonna discuss the paper. Elena, if you can do it in 5-6 minutes maximum. Thank you so much.
Yes, okay. Thanks a lot for having me here today and to give me the chance to discuss this paper, which I enjoyed very much. So, San Salvador, free from organized gangs until the US government decided to repatriate Salvadorian refugees that in Los Angeles happened to be founding very dangerous gangs, Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18. So, the paper analyzed rest on two main exercises. The first is a spatial regression discontinuity design. These are my own drawing, Maria Micaela, so I hope I interpret it just to show people precisely what you're doing. So you take these patches, these are where the gang, the blue, dark blue and blue are where the gangs happen to take root in San Salvador. If you take the dots are the centroid of census tract, this paper, the main exercise of this paper uses this border between census tracts that happen to be in a gang-dominated area and census tracts that happen to be not in a gang-dominated area, take borders, very close borders, 400 meters maximum, but really looks at the distance close by. And the assumption then is, okay, maybe gangs happen to locate in certain neighborhood, etc. But at the borders, where this border was established, if we take 50 meters here and 50 meters there, the treatment is as good as random. This is the idea of the discontinuity design. This is the result in a jest. I don't want to repeat, but the idea, what the results show is that at the border, the dwellings, becomes much worse. The household wealth decrease, individuals become poorer, and they also look at income, and people make lower income. Very importantly, if you look at this discontinuity, in 1992, you see no jump. They complement this analysis with a diff in diff, which is different. They take the full country, they split it in grids, and they compare. They look at the change in light luminosity that took place between 1992 and 1997, comparing places where you had gang presence and places that didn't. Very important research agenda. So this is a silent war that is paralyzing a country. So I was very happy to read this paper. I think it's a crucial issue. There's an impressive amount of data, some of them collected by the author. The most interesting thing is the mechanism that this paper highlights. So if you read the newspaper, and of course yesterday I started to watch documentary because I got very excited about the topic, and the limited movement of people that happen to be in gang-dominated area is a huge issue. Kids cannot go even outside play. So my first advice, in the discussion, you say is policy relevant. Can you do more? Can you try to be a bit creative? What are the policy implications? I don't know the context, so I just give you mine. But can the government become very pragmatic and establish their own checkpoint to guarantee freedom of movement? I don't know. My advice in the conclusion: try to suggest some policy implications, because I think it's true they are policy implications. And then just 2 or 3 comments. Selective migration. So the appendix is very long. I didn't have any brilliant idea. You have 77 exercise and robustness. Not of my small idea increase the value added. So my advice is on the writing, on the interpretation of results, and on the shades of your argument. When you go so micro, people move. So right now the strategy is to downplay the effect of selective migration or migration. I think maybe it would be better to say, document just the migration there is. As you do, you have stuff in the appendix. So document, are people migrating more in these very close bands? Are migrating more to the abroad? No. You have the share of people living there since forever. Is it different in the 2 sides? Just document it, and then maybe you can provide an idea of how much it matters. But it's difficult to believe that there's no migration and people don't try very hard to get out of neighborhood control gang. And especially because some of your results suggest a Islamification. This place seems to be becoming informal. No? So you have dwellings with no electricity, bare floor, no toilet. So this people might think, okay, maybe these are becoming slums a bit. Maybe people that are coming back from the US go there because they can arrange informal housing. So this is something that people keep on their mind. You don't have to discard it. Your mechanism remain very interesting. I think it is a safer solution, because I mean, at such a disaggregated level, people move. It's impossible to believe not. What happened to the labor market? Maybe you can tell us a bit what happened to the people in this area. So was there a shift from formal to informal economy? If the states cannot come, maybe I can stop paying taxes or doing, or maybe I work out of the record. And but this is, again, it's just a matter of documenting it a bit with with anecdotes. And so the gang member are 30,000, 40,000, but with the relatives, it seems that it affects 10% of the population. So maybe some of the women are working for the gangs, it seems. So there's a circle of people that are living out of the gang. You already have a lot of it. I would add that you have so many outcomes that you can really tease these things apart. Maybe it's just a matter of structuring the outcomes to say formal or informal. Last comment to give space to people is, okay, you have a diff-in-diff and the spatial regression discontinuity design. What did these 2 exercises identify, as you said, are very different things. So the spatial regression discontinuity design is perfect. It basically captures the extra negative effect of living in a gang-controlled neighborhood versus living in a not gang-controlled neighborhood. It's the extra effect. So it is a setting for shedding light of your channel, which is limited mobility. Extortion, it's a cost that the gangs impose on El Salvador, but it's cannot be captured by your setting, because there's no difference. So I would emphasize that your setting is specific for the channel you're aiming to shed light. And in this sense, the difference in difference, I think you need a little bit to reconcile. It's a more aggregate effect, capture different mechanisms. So wouldn't it be maybe more effective as motivating evidence at the beginning, showing that things in El Salvador changed dramatically after the inflow of people from Los Angeles, and then going deeper into the channel with the spatial regression discontinuity design? So just that's it. Thanks a lot for having me reading this paper.
Thank you so much, Elena, for all the comments.
You're welcome.
And Mika, we have three comments from the
Yes.
chat. If you're okay, I'm going to read them, and then you can try to answer whichever question you want. The first one, if you can give more details on the 2 gangs here. Tyler say that you have territorial gangs that want to capture territory. You have commercial gangs, I guess they focus on shops, and then you have corporate gangs that focus on markets, and they don't need to focus on territory as much. So where's the 2 gangs different? What type of gangs they were? This was the first question. The second question is Tyler wants to know more about your effect on security, because if with the gang and before you had the police that was corrupt or something, now you have a gang. The gang have an interest in having a place more secure and controlling conflict. At their advantage, sure, but you get less conflict. I know you have this result where you see you don't have an effect on conflict, but if you can talk more about that. And the last question from Taka is, what about the effect by gender for men versus women? I think that'll be very interesting here. And Aeon has a question I just read. Aeon, do you want to read your question if you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. Just a quick one. It's only tangentially related, but I wonder, has anyone estimated the effect of these deportations on outcomes in LA, in the origin area, particularly in light of what Chris said earlier? Because I was certainly surprised with the idea that when you incarcerate gang leaders, you're actually incarcerating the potential peacemakers, and it has a counterintuitive effect.
No, nobody. I will start with it, but there is no study on that, to the best of my knowledge.
Okay, Mika, go ahead. You have 3 minutes.
Perfect. I will start with the selective migration. You are right. We need to rewrite, I think, a bit of that, because there is one result that got missed in the whole explanation what we do in that long appendix, which is actually we look, as you said, as an outcome, and we don't see any differential effect on the share of individuals that have members abroad or that have migrated internally. We even check whether richer people are more likely to migrate. We see that, but it's equally the same whether you're in the gang control neighborhood versus you're in the nearby areas. That's the one point. But you're right, that is an interesting mechanism. We should put it there as part of the mechanism. Then I think the other question was related to security that Remi read. So basically here in San Salvador, particular the city, we are focusing in areas where they are not contesting the territory. This is different than other locations in El Salvador. El Salvador, also there are other locations where we have actually the boundaries of maps. I'm looking here because I have one of the maps where they are still contested. We could do something to see which are the effects of contestation using those maps. Here are more stable territories where they did this, basically this rearrangement of having all these checkpoints and restrictions to mobility. What we see in these places which are not contested, which is San Salvador, where I show you today, is we check whether there is an increase on homicides in either side of the boundaries. And what we see consistently is that there is a jump in homicides, if anything, in the boundaries, right in the boundary. So basically you see that, and this actually is a nice exercise for us to validate the stability of these boundaries. And we see from 2003 onwards, every year, a jump there. So basically most of the conflict that occur in these locations is when someone tries to enter and is not from that area. And this is actually when we were doing the pilot, this happened to us. I entered, and since I didn't see anyone stopping me, I started doing it. Immediately, someone came and said, you need to leave because if not, we will think that you are an informant and violence can occur. So we left. So this is the thing of security, but again, the results of the different diff have a bit of that, of the problems of security and contestation they are in those results. So if you see a big decline that you start seeing in the first year, is because of all this conflict between these two main gangs. I think someone asked about the different type of gangs. It's true that MS-13, for instance, is much more organized than Neighborhood 18. We thought that we were going to find something interesting there, but the effects hold in similar magnitudes for both. These gangs in these territories of San Salvador are mainly doing extortion. I think someone asked that, maybe I understood wrong the question, but this is mainly extortion. In other locations, for instance, in the north, near to a main highway, they also do some drug trafficking, which is part of the criminal capital that they also brought from LA. And the heterogeneity of the results. We check, for instance, by gender, and we also see that restrictions to mobility apply by to women, and also the income effects.